No barrier is too great, no journey too long. With God, every obstacle is an opportunity to go further than you ever imagined. Have you ever felt like there's a wall in front of you that seems impossible to overcome? Maybe you're facing challenges that feel insurmountable, or perhaps you've been waiting for a breakthrough that just hasn't come yet. I want to share something with you today that will ignite hope in your heart and remind you that no barrier is too big for the power of God. Whether it's fear, doubt, discouragement, or even failure, God is bigger than all of it. In fact, not only will He break every barrier before you, but He will take you further than you ever imagined. As we dive into today's message, I want you to open your heart to a fresh revelation of God's incredible power. God has a plan for you that goes far beyond anything you've ever dreamed, and He's about to show you how to navigate through your toughest obstacles. So stay with me until the end of this video, because what you're about to hear could change your perspective, strengthen your faith, and propel you into a future of unlimited possibilities. Let's dive in together and discover how God is not just breaking barriers, but taking us further into His purpose. Barriers are real but never final. This is a truth that echoes through every page of Scripture and every story of the faithful who have gone before us. In a world broken by sin, barriers are inevitable. They come in many forms: fear, discouragement, sickness, loss, betrayal, even the weight of our own regrets. Each one stands before us like an immovable wall, whispering that the journey is over, that the promise has failed, that hope is foolish. And yet these barriers are not final because they are not authored by the one who writes our true story. God is the Alpha and the Omega. He alone has the final word, not our circumstances, not our failures, not the enemies who rise against us. The children of Israel stood before the Red Sea, hearing the thunder of Pharaoh's chariots behind them. To human eyes, the sea was a barrier too wide, too deep, too wild. Yet in the hands of God, the sea was not an end, but a passageway. With a breath, He split the waters and made a road through the impossible. The barrier that seemed so permanent crumbled under the power of His will. Over and over again, God shows that what we call impossible, He calls opportunity. He turns graves into gardens, mourning into dancing, weeping into testimony. It is crucial for the people of God to remember that the reality of a barrier does not determine the final outcome. Our faith is not a denial of reality. We see the walls, we feel the weight, but it is a refusal to believe that reality has the last say. When Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, when Paul was chained in a prison cell, when Jesus hung upon the cross, every visible sign pointed to defeat. Yet defeat was never the end of the story. The lions' mouths were shut. The prison doors shook open. The stone was rolled away. Barriers, no matter how towering they may seem, cannot withstand the power of God's divine intervention. The enemy will try to convince you that the presence of a barrier is proof that God has abandoned you. But in truth, the barrier is often the stage upon which God reveals His greatest glory. It is there, in the place where human effort ends, that divine strength begins. It is there, where your resources run dry, that His rivers of living water begin to flow. If you are standing before a barrier today, it does not mean you are forgotten. It means you are perfectly positioned for a miracle. Faith does not pretend the wall is not there. Faith declares that the wall will not stand forever. It leans on the promises of a God who has never lost a battle. It believes that every barrier is temporary, every obstacle an invitation to see God move in ways beyond human understanding. In the economy of heaven, every setback is a setup for a greater victory, every delay a preparation for deeper fulfillment. The barriers that loom so large in this present moment will one day be seen as tiny stones that pave the way for your testimony. The story God is writing for your life does not end at the wall. It moves through it by His power into a future more glorious than you can imagine. God specializes in the impossible. This is not just a comforting idea or a lofty theological concept. It is the very nature of who He is. The Scriptures are filled with the testimonies of individuals who were called to do what was beyond human ability, who were asked to trust in a God whose power transcends all limitations. From the moment God spoke the universe into existence, He set the precedent for the impossible becoming possible. becoming possible. Every miracle recorded in the Bible serves as a reminder that God doesn't just deal with the ordinary, He is the God of the extraordinary. He doesn't just work within the realm of what is achievable, He steps into our impossibilities and redefines what is possible. When we look at the life of Sarah, we are reminded that God specializes in the impossible. A woman well beyond the years of childbearing, whose womb had long been closed, heard the impossible promise, "You will have a son." The laughter that followed from her heart was not the laughter of joy, but of disbelief. And yet, with God, the impossible was made possible. The promise was fulfilled, and through her, generations were birthed. Sarah's story stands as a testimony that the God who opens barren wombs can also open doors that seem locked forever and bring forth fruit from places we thought were dry. Consider the story of Moses and the Israelites standing before the Red Sea. With Pharaoh's army bearing down upon them, it seemed as if there was no escape. The sea was an impassable barrier. There was no human plan, no military strategy, no force strong enough to part the waters. And yet when the Israelites obeyed God's command and stretched out their hands in faith, the impossible became reality. The sea parted, the ground dried up, and the people walked through on dry land. The walls of water that stood on either side of them were nothing to the Creator of the sea. What was impossible for man was but a mere moment's command for God. The impossible is not just a backdrop for biblical history, it is the arena in which God continues to work today. When Jesus walked on water, when He turned water into wine, when He healed the sick and raised the dead, He was revealing the nature of God's power. Jesus was showing us that with God, no situation is beyond redemption. He wasn't just performing miracles for the sake of spectacle. He was demonstrating that God can break through any barrier, transform any situation, and create something beautiful out of nothing. This same God is the one who calls us to believe that He can still do the impossible in our lives today. But our human limitations often lead us to doubt what God can do. We see only what is in front of us, our lack of resources, our inexperience, our brokenness, our fear, and we allow these limitations to define what is possible. But God specializes in breaking these boundaries. He asks us to look beyond what we can see and trust in what He can do. What seems like an insurmountable challenge is simply an opportunity for God to display His power in ways that will leave us in awe and wonder. God has never been bound by the limits of time, space, or circumstance. When He calls you to a task, He equips you, not with what you already have, but with what only He can provide. What you consider impossible, He considers a canvas for His glory. The impossible in your life is merely a backdrop for the display of His greatness. God specializes in the impossible because in His hands, nothing is beyond His reach, and everything is an opportunity for His power to be revealed. Our limitations are often the very places where God's strength and grace shine the brightest. It's human nature to want to hide our weaknesses and to avoid situations where we feel inadequate. But in God's kingdom, it is precisely in those moments of vulnerability that His power is most profoundly displayed. God does not choose the qualified, the strong, or the self-sufficient to accomplish His work. Rather, He delights in using those who recognize their insufficiency, those who are willing to admit their brokenness. It is in our limitations that we are most open to God's transforming power. Throughout Scripture, God consistently chooses the weak, the broken, and the outcast to accomplish His purposes. He chose Moses, a man with a speech impediment, to lead a nation out of bondage. He chose David, a young shepherd boy, to defeat a giant and become king. He chose Peter, a fisherman with a temper, to be the rock upon which He would build His church. Each of these individuals had glaring limitations, fears, insecurities, and shortcomings that would disqualify them by human standards. And yet, in their limitations, God's power was made perfect. Their inadequacies became the stage for His glory. When Paul spoke of his own limitations, he wrote about a thorn in the flesh that he begged God to remove. Yet instead of removing it, God told him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." This is a truth we must come to understand. Our weaknesses are not obstacles to God's work in us. They are the very things that allow His power to shine through. If we were always strong, self-reliant, and capable, we would never fully experience the sufficiency of God's grace. It is only when we are aware of our need that we open the door for God to work in us and through us. Our limitations force us to lean on God in ways that we otherwise might not. It is when we reach the end of ourselves that we encounter the boundless nature of God. He is the God who works wonders through the unlikely, the underdog, and the broken. He delights in taking what the world rejects and turning it into something beautiful. The very things that we think disqualify us are often the things God uses most powerfully to further His kingdom. The story of the cross itself is the ultimate example. A criminal's death turned into the greatest victory in history. What seemed like the ultimate limitation, a brutal, shameful death, became the means by which God reconciled the world to Himself. In our own lives, the limitations we face, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, are not signs that God has forgotten us. They are invitations for us to trust more deeply in His grace, to allow His strength to be made manifest in our weakness. When we come to God in humility, acknowledging our limitations, we make room for His miraculous power to flow through us. In fact, our limitations may be the very thing that positions us for the greatest work He has called us to do. As we allow God to work in our weakness, He reveals His strength, His love, and His sufficiency in ways that can transform not only our lives, but also the lives of those around us. The power of God does not diminish because we are weak. On the contrary, it is in our weakness that His strength is perfected. When we surrender our limitations to Him, we make space for the miraculous to unfold. God uses our weaknesses not only to transform us, but also to testify to the world that His grace is enough, that His power is greater than any human limitation. In our brokenness He is made whole, and in our inadequacy His sufficiency is revealed. The journey of faith always takes us further than we could ever imagine. When God leads us, He does not merely guide us to a destination. He leads us on a transformative path that stretches the very limits of our hearts and minds. God's plans are always greater than we can conceive in our limited human understanding. The journey He calls us to is not one of mere survival or getting by. It is one of expansion, growth, and discovery, where each step we take opens up new vistas of His glory and goodness. When we read the story of Abraham, we see the powerful example of a journey that took him far beyond his wildest expectations. God called him to leave everything he knew, his family, his home, his comfort, to follow a promise. At first, the promise seemed distant, abstract, and impossible. Abraham had no child, and his years were passing. But God's promise was not just about reaching a destination. It was about the journey of faith. Along the way, Abraham would encounter moments of doubt, moments of failure, and moments of faithfulness. But through it all, God was not just leading him to a place. He was shaping Abraham into the man who would father a nation. The journey took him further than he could have imagined, far beyond the land he thought was the end goal, to a deeper relationship with the one who had called him. The journey of faith is not simply about reaching our goals or fulfilling our dreams. It is about being shaped, refined, and prepared for a future we could never have anticipated. The Israelites, too, experienced this as they wandered through the wilderness. God didn't simply lead them out of Egypt. He led them to a place of trust, dependence, and transformation. The wilderness was not a detour or a delay. It was the necessary path to the promised land. It was in the wilderness that God tested their hearts, purged their doubts, and prepared them for the blessings that lay ahead. The journey took them further than they could have imagined, beyond their comfort zones, beyond their expectations, to a land flowing with milk and honey. Jesus' ministry also illustrates this truth. When He called His disciples, He didn't just call them to follow Him on a simple journey. He called them into a radical redefinition of what life, purpose, and mission meant. The disciples began by following Jesus through towns, witnessing miracles, hearing teachings, and watching Him heal the sick. But as they followed Him, they began to understand that the journey was leading them somewhere much greater than they had ever thought possible. They were being prepared for the work of building His church, a mission that would take them beyond their own lives, beyond their own comforts, and ultimately beyond the boundaries of the known world. The journey of following Jesus took them further than they could have imagined, to the ends of the earth, spreading the good news of salvation. In our own lives, the journey of faith often leads us into the unknown. We may feel like we are walking through dark and uncertain places, not knowing what the next step holds. But God's promise is that the journey will always take us further, not just to new places, but into deeper dimensions of His love, His power, and His purpose for our lives. 8. What God has for you is far beyond what you can see right now. He is leading you, step by step, into a future filled with more than you could ask or imagine. Every challenge you face, every obstacle you overcome is part of the greater journey He is taking you on. A journey that is not just about getting from here to there, but about becoming more like Him in the process. The further you go, the greater His glory will be revealed in and through you. Faith is not merely about believing for the miraculous or hoping for the best outcome. It is about trusting God through the entire process. This means that it is not just the promises of God that we hold on to, but also the process He takes us through in order to fulfill those promises. The Christian journey is filled with waiting, questioning, and sometimes enduring moments that feel heavy and uncertain. But in these moments, our trust is being tested and refined. It's easy to place our faith in the outcome, in the arrival at the promised land, but true faith is about resting in God's faithfulness, even when the journey doesn't look the way we expect it to. When we look at the life of Joseph, we see an example of faith in the midst of a long, painful process. God gave Joseph a dream of greatness, of ruling over his brothers and even his family. Yet instead of seeing that promise fulfilled quickly, Joseph was thrown into a pit by his brothers, sold into slavery, and unjustly imprisoned. His circumstances seemed to contradict the very promise God had given him. In these moments of waiting and suffering, it would have been easy for Joseph to doubt or lose faith in God's plan. But Joseph remained faithful. He trusted that God was with him, even in the darkest moments of his life. He didn't just trust God for the promise. He trusted Him through the painful journey that led him to it. Ultimately, God fulfilled His promise, and Joseph became second in command over Egypt, saving nations from famine. But the process, the journey, was as much a part of God's plan as the destination itself. Similarly, the life of the Apostle Paul is a testament to this kind of faith. Paul's ministry was marked not only by incredible moments of revelation and miracles, but also by intense trials, beatings, imprisonments, and rejection. Yet through all of this, Paul did not waver in his trust that God was working through him, even when things seemed impossible. In his letter to the Corinthians, he writes about his struggles and weaknesses, saying, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.'" Paul understood that God's power is often most evident when we are at our weakest, and that the process of suffering and hardship is not a sign that God has abandoned us, but a testament to His ongoing work in us. This kind of faith requires us to trust not just for the outcome, but for the process itself, to believe that God is working even when we cannot see it, and that He is using every moment, every challenge, every setback for our ultimate good. It means having the confidence that God's timing is perfect, even when we feel like we are running out of time, and that He is making us ready for what He has promised, even when the waiting feels unbearable. True faith does not just celebrate the breakthrough, it is the heart that praises God in the waiting. It is the belief that God is good, that He is faithful, and that He is always at work in our lives, even in seasons of silence or struggle. When we trust God through the process, we allow Him to shape our character, to build our perseverance, and to deepen our relationship with Him. It is in the waiting, in the uncertainty, and in the struggle that we grow closer to God and become more like Him. The journey, no matter how difficult, is a sacred part of God's plan to fulfill His promises in us. In conclusion, we stand assured that God is not only able to break every barrier before us, but that He will take us further than we ever imagined. No obstacle, no matter how great it seems, can hinder the plans He has for our lives. His ways are higher than ours, and His purpose for us is far beyond what we can comprehend. Even in our weaknesses and limitations, He works in ways that display His incredible strength and grace. The journey may not always be easy, and the process may take longer than we wish, but through it all, God is faithful. He specializes in the impossible, and He will always lead us to places that exceed our dreams and expectations. Our faith in Him is not only about the destination, but about trusting Him through every step, every trial, and every moment of waiting. As we embrace His promises and the journey He has set before us, let us remember that He is with us, now and always, taking us further than we could ever go on our own. With every barrier broken, with every step forward, we grow deeper in His love, in His grace, and in His purpose for our lives. Thank you for being part of this moment today. May you walk in the full assurance that God is not only breaking every barrier in your life, but leading you into a future filled with His blessings, grace, and limitless possibilities. God bless you abundantly, and may His peace be with you always.